Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the endless cycle of fire and dark that has shaped countless worlds across time immemorial. Tonight, we'll explore the complete saga of flame and shadow, from the first kindling of the Age of Fire to its inevitable fade into darkness, and the eternal dance between light and shadow that defines all existence. This is a story of gods and hollow men, of kingdoms built on lies and truths too terrible to bear, of the choices that echo across ages. So settle in, let the warmth of distant fires comfort you, and let your mind drift through these timeless tales of light and shadow. In the beginning, before memory became legend, and legend became myth, there existed a world that knew neither the warmth of flame nor the depths of shadow. This was the Age of Ancients, a time so distant that even the stones themselves have forgotten its passing, when all creation existed in a state of perfect, eternal stillness that would have seemed both paradise and prison to those who came after. The world of that primordial age bore no resemblance to the lands that would one day flourish under sun and moon, fire and dark. It was a realm of grey crags that stretched beyond the horizon like the bones of some titanic creature, their surfaces worn smooth by winds that had blown unchanged for countless eons. These ancient stones held within them the memory of a time when change itself was unknown, when the very concept of transformation lay dormant in the heart of creation, like a seed waiting for the proper season to bloom. Above this landscape of eternal stone rose the arch trees, colossal beings that defied easy classification as either plant or mineral, alive or dead. These titans of bark and stone towered into skies that knew no weather, their massive trunks so wide that entire civilizations could have made their homes within the hollows of their ancient hearts. Their branches stretched like the arms of sleeping giants, creating canopies that filtered the grey light of that changeless world into patterns of shadow and illumination that remained constant across the ages. The arch trees were more than mere flora, if indeed flora was the proper term for being so ancient and strange. They were the pillars that supported the very concept of existence, living monuments to a time when life and death, growth and decay were foreign concepts that had not yet entered the vocabulary of creation. Their roots descended into depths that no mortal eye had ever seen, drawing sustenance from sources that predated the distinction between earth and sky, matter and void. Among these stone sentinels and eternal trees moved the true masters of that age, beings whose power and majesty would echo through all the eons that followed, even as their time passed into memory and their dominion crumbled into dust. These were the everlasting dragons, creatures so perfectly suited to their world of unchanging grey that they seemed less like inhabitants than like living embodiments of the age itself. The dragons of that primordial time bore little resemblance to the great worms that would later rule the skies of younger worlds. Their scales were not the gleaming armor of conquest, but stone-made living, grey as the crags on which they rested, eternal as the arch trees beneath whose branches they made their roosts. Each scale was a small mountain in its own right, worn smooth by ages beyond counting, yet harder than the strongest steel that would ever be forged in the fires of later ages. These ancient sovereigns possessed a majesty that was born not of conquest or dominion, but of simple, undeniable existence. They had no need to assert their authority because they were authority itself, woven into the very fabric of their world so completely that to imagine that realm without them was to imagine a contradiction in terms. Their presence was the bedrock upon which all reality rested. Their breath, the wind that stirred the branches of the arch trees. Their dreams, the only change that grey world ever knew. The dragons understood their realm in ways that transcended the crude categories of knowledge that lesser beings would one day develop. They knew the weight of each stone in the endless crags, the age of every branch on every arch tree, the precise pattern of light and shadow that had played across their domain since time began. This was not learning but being, not wisdom, but existence itself made conscious and given form. Yet even in this realm of perfect stasis, there existed the seeds of change, though they lay so deeply buried that even the dragon's ancient sight could not perceive them. For perfection, as would one day be understood, carries within itself the potential for its own transformation. The very completeness of that grey world created a kind of emptiness, a hollow space where something new might one day take root and grow. Time in that ancient realm moved differently than it would in the ages to come, if indeed it moved at all. There were no seasons to mark its passage, no births or deaths to create the rhythms that would one day give meaning to the concept of duration. The dragons might rest upon their stone perches for what would later be measured as millennia, their great hearts beating perhaps once in what younger creatures would call a lifetime, their thoughts moving through contemplations vast and slow as the drift of continents. This was not a world of action or adventure, not a realm where heroes might win glory or kingdoms rise and fall. It was instead a place of pure being, where existence itself was enough, where the simple fact of continuance was the highest achievement imaginable. The dragons asked nothing of their world because there was nothing to ask for. They desired nothing because desire itself was a concept that had not yet been born. But among even the most ancient and eternal of beings, there sometimes appears an exception, an anomaly that carries within itself the potential to transform everything it touches. In that age of perfect uniformity, when all dragons bore the same stone scales and shared the same eternal perspective, there arose one whose very existence was a contradiction, a living question posed to the certainties of his age. This was Seath the Scaleless, born without the stone hide that marked all his kind, his pale form a startling contrast to the grey majesty of his brethren. Where others possessed scales that could turn aside any force their world could conjure, Seath's flesh was soft and vulnerable, marked by what his kin could only perceive as incompleteness, as a fundamental failure to achieve the perfection that defined their species. The other dragons regarded their scaleless brother with emotions that their static world had never before required them to feel. Some felt what might be called pity, though that word would not exist for ages yet to come. Others experienced something approaching revulsion, a deep discomfort at seeing one of their kind so obviously flawed, so fundamentally broken, in ways that challenged their understanding of what it meant to be a dragon. But Seath himself felt something far more dangerous than pity or revulsion. He felt envy, a gnawing hunger for what his brothers and sisters possessed by birthright, but which had been denied to him by the cruel mathematics of creation. Every day of his long existence reminded him of his inadequacy. Every reflection in the still pools that gathered at the base of the arch trees showed him anew how far he fell short of the perfection that surrounded him. This envy burned within him like a flame that had no name, for fire itself had not yet been born into the world. It grew stronger with each passing age, feeding on itself until it became something more than mere wanting. It became a kind of reverse faith, a belief in the fundamental injustice of existence itself, a conviction that the order of their world was not perfect but profoundly flawed. Seath began to study his realm with eyes that saw not perfection but limitation, not eternal beauty, but stagnant decay. He observed the unchanging patterns of light and shadow, the endless repetition of days that were identical to all the days that had come before them, the terrible sameness that his brothers and sisters mistook for paradise. And in that observation, he began to understand something that none of his kind had ever grasped, that perfection itself might be a kind of death, a closing off of all possibility in favor of one single, eternal moment. The scaleless dragon began to search through the deepest places of his world, exploring caverns that his brethren had never bothered to investigate because they held nothing that could change or surprise. He descended through layers of stone and time, past the roots of the greatest arch trees, into chambers that existed at the very foundation of creation itself. And there, in the deepest darkness his world had ever known, he found something that would change everything. Hidden in those primordial depths, pulsing with a light that was somehow both illumination and warmth, lay something that had never existed before in the grey realm of the dragons. It was a flame, but not merely fire, as later ages would understand it. This was the first flame, the original spark of change, the seed from which all transformation would grow. Its light was not the grey illumination that filtered through the arch tree branches, but something entirely new, something that cast shadows that danced and flickered, that created not the eternal patterns his world had always known, but new shapes that shifted from moment to moment. The flame sang to Seath in voices that spoke of change and possibility, of a world where being scaleless might not be a curse but a gift, where imperfection might be the key to achieving something greater than the static perfection his brothers and sisters cherished. It whispered of power that could be earned rather than inherited, of greatness that could be achieved rather than simply accepted as an unchanging birthright. But the first flame held more than just the promise of personal transformation. Within its dancing heart lay the potential for disparity itself, the concept that would shatter the eternal unity of the grey world and replace it with something far more complex and dangerous. Here were the seeds of light and dark, life and death, heat and cold, order and chaos. Here was the end of the Age of Ancients and the beginning of everything that would follow. Seath understood, perhaps even before he fully grasped the implications of his discovery, that this flame represented not just change, but the fundamental principle of change itself. It was not merely a source of heat and light, but the origin of difference, the first crack in the perfect surface of his static world. And in that understanding, he made a choice that would echo through all the ages to come, a decision that would transform him from victim to architect of a new age. The dragons had ruled their grey realm not through conquest, but through simple existence, not through struggle, but through the effortless maintenance of an eternal status quo. They were perfect, complete, unchanging, and therefore ultimately vulnerable to the one force they had never learned to confront, the possibility of transformation itself. And so Seath the Scaleless, the flawed one, the incomplete one, the dragon who had never truly belonged to his own kind, became the instrument through which the Age of Ancients would end. His envy and his hunger for what he could never possess by right would become the tools by which an entirely new form of existence would be born. The first flame had found its prophet, and through him it would remake the world. The discovery of the flame marked the end of the world's innocence, though the dragons themselves did not yet understand what their scaleless brother had found in the depths. They continued their eternal contemplations, unaware that the very foundations of their existence were already beginning to shift beneath them. The arch trees still stretched toward the changeless sky. The stone crags still bore their ancient scars, but something fundamental had altered in the deep places of the world. Soon the flame would call to others, and they would come. Lords would claim its power, armies would march under its banner, and the eternal dragons would face their first and final war. But that is a tale for another telling, for another moment in our long journey through the cycle of fire and dark. For now, it is enough to remember that even in the most perfect of worlds, change waits patiently in the darkness, and that sometimes it takes the flawed and broken to open the door through which transformation enters. The Age of Ancients was ending, though it would take eons more for that ending to become apparent to all who lived through it. The grey world of stone and scale was giving way to something new, something that would know the warmth of flame and the depth of shadow, the joy of life and the sorrow of death. The eternal dance of fire and dark was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. When the first flame was discovered in the depths beneath the grey world, it did not remain hidden for long in the darkness where Seath the Scaleless had first glimpsed its transformative light. The flame called to those who possessed the strength and vision to claim its power, and from the shadowy places of the ancient realm came beings who would reshape the very nature of existence itself. These were not dragons, not creatures of the eternal grey, but something new, something that had been waiting in the forgotten corners of creation for their moment to step into the light of history. The flame burned with a radiance that had never been seen in that primordial world, casting shadows that danced and shifted in patterns that spoke of change, of transformation, of the endless possibilities that lay dormant within the heart of creation itself. But this was not merely a source of heat and illumination. Within the dancing tongues of fire lay something far more precious and dangerous: the Lord's souls, fragments of power so fundamental that they would become the bedrock upon which all future ages would be built. 4 souls rested within the flame's embrace, each one a key to a different aspect of existence, each one waiting for a champion worthy of its burden. These were not mere treasures to be claimed by the strongest or the most cunning, but aspects of reality itself made manifest, pieces of the cosmic order that would define the roles their bearers would play in the great drama about to unfold. The first and greatest of these souls blazed with a light that seemed to contain within it all the warmth and brilliance that the grey world had never known. This was the Lord's Soul of Light, a fragment of power so radiant that it promised to banish forever the endless twilight that had shrouded the ancient realm since time began. It called to one whose ambition matched its magnificence, whose vision of order and hierarchy resonated with its essential nature. From the shadows stepped Gwyn, a being whose very presence seemed to herald the dawn of a new age. Tall and regal, with eyes that burned with an inner fire that reflected the soul he would claim, Gwyn possessed the bearing of one born to rule, the natural authority that marked him as a leader among the strange new entities that had emerged to challenge the dragon's ancient dominion. When he reached into the flame and claimed the Lord's Soul of Light, the very air around him began to shimmer with golden radiance, and the first rays of true sunlight the world had ever seen burst forth from his transformed being. Gwyn's ascension marked more than the claiming of power. It represented the birth of hierarchy itself, the introduction of rank and order into a world that had known only the uniform perfection of the dragon's eternal reign. He became the Lord of Sunlight, the first king of a realm that would stretch far beyond the grey crags of the ancient world, a sovereign whose light would touch every corner of creation and remake it in his image. But light alone could not define the new age that was being born within the flame's embrace. From another shadow emerged a figure whose power lay not in illumination, but in the forces of life and transformation that would make the coming age one of growth and change rather than eternal stasis. This was the Witch of Izalith, a being whose mastery over the fundamental forces of existence would make her both creator and destroyer, mother and executioner to the new world taking shape around the first flame. The Lord's soul she claimed from the fire's heart was one of life, a fragment of power that pulsed with the rhythm of growing things, with the endless cycle of birth and decay that would replace the changeless perfection of the dragon's realm. In her hands, this soul became the key to understanding flame not merely as light and heat, but as the fundamental force of change itself. the power that could transform the dead grey of ancient stone into the living green of forest and field. The witch understood fire in ways that would make her legendary among all who came after. She saw within its dancing heart not just destruction but creation, not just consumption but transformation. Her flames could kindle life where none had existed before, could reshape the very substance of matter according to her will, could nurture growing things, or reduce them to ash with equal facility. She became the mother of pyromancy, the art of flame magic that would spread throughout the coming age, like seeds scattered on fertile ground. Yet the new world being born required more than light and life to achieve completeness. From the deepest shadows came a third claimant to the flame's power, a being whose dominion would be over the one force that the ancient dragons had never truly understood: death itself. This was Nito, the first of the dead, whose very existence was a contradiction to everything the eternal realm had represented. Nito's form defied easy description, for death had not existed in the world of the dragons, and thus there were no words to capture the essence of one who had made ending his domain. He was vast and terrible, composed of countless bones and souls that had found their final rest within his embrace, a living monument to the inevitability of decay that would balance the creative forces unleashed by his fellow lords. The soul he claimed from the flame was that of death, and with it came the power to bring conclusion to even the most eternal of beings. Where Gwyn brought light and the witch brought life, Nito brought the concept of finality, the understanding that all things must eventually come to an end. His gift to the new world was not merely the ability to die, but the knowledge that death gave meaning to life, that without ending there could be no true beginning, that only through accepting the reality of conclusion could existence achieve its full potential. But there was a fourth soul within the flame, smaller than the others, easily overlooked in the brilliance of its companions, yet perhaps the most significant of all. This was the dark soul, and the one who claimed it was so unassuming, so seemingly insignificant, that history would remember him only as the furtive pygmy, the forgotten one whose contribution to the new age would be hidden from view until its true importance could no longer be denied. The pygmy was neither tall nor mighty, neither radiant nor terrible. He possessed none of the obvious majesty of Gwyn, none of the transformative power of the witch, none of the inevitable authority of Nito. Yet in claiming the dark soul, he became the father of something that would prove more enduring than kingdoms, more transformative than magic, more inevitable than death itself. Humanity. The dark soul was unique among its brethren, for while the others were single, unified fragments of power, it was naturally fragmentary, designed to be broken and shared, to grow through division, rather than diminish through distribution. From this one small soul would spring countless others, each one a spark of darkness that would kindle into human consciousness, each one a seed from which would grow the capacity for choice, for change, for the kind of transformation that could not be imposed from above, but had to emerge from within. The pygmy understood, perhaps better than his more obvious companions, that the true revolution they were beginning lay not in replacing the dragon's rule with their own, but in introducing the very concept of change itself into a world that had known only stasis. The dark soul he carried would become the birthright of every human who would ever live, the fragment of primordial darkness that would give them the capacity to grow beyond their origins, to become something more than they were born to be. With the four Lord Souls claimed and their bearers transformed into beings of unprecedented power, the stage was set for the first great conflict the world had ever known. The dragons still ruled from their perches among the arch trees, still dreamed their eternal dreams of changeless perfection, still believed in the fundamental rightness of their static realm. But their age was ending. though they did not yet know it. And the war that would decide the fate of all existence was about to begin. The war against the dragons would not be a simple matter of strength against strength, for the ancient lords of the Grey Realm possessed power that had been accumulating for eons beyond counting. Their stone scales could turn aside any weapon that the young world could forge. Their breath could petrify armies with a single exhalation. Their very presence commanded a kind of respect that bordered on religious awe. To defeat them would require more than force. It would require treachery, sacrifice, and the kind of strategic thinking that the static world of the dragons had never needed to develop. Gwyn understood that victory could not be achieved through honorable combat alone. The dragons were simply too powerful, too perfectly adapted to their realm, too unified in their ancient purpose. To defeat them, the lords would need to exploit the one weakness that perfection always carries within itself, its inability to adapt to truly fundamental change. And for that, they would need an ally from among the enemy's own ranks, one who understood both the dragon's strengths and their hidden vulnerabilities. Seath the Scaleless became the key to everything that followed. His knowledge of dragon lore, his understanding of their habits and weaknesses, his burning resentment at his own exclusion from their perfect society, all of these made him the ideal traitor to his own kind. In exchange for his aid in the coming war, the lords promised him something his birthright had denied him: immortality that did not depend on the stone scales he had never possessed, power that came from knowledge rather than inheritance, a place in the new order that would be built on the ashes of the old. The weapons of war that emerged from this alliance between the lords and their dragon defector were unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Gwyn's lightning could shatter even the strongest stone scales, revealing the vulnerable flesh beneath the dragon's armor. The witch's flames could burn with heat intense enough to melt dragonbone, while Nito's power over death could claim even beings who had thought themselves eternal. And Seath provided the knowledge that made these weapons effective, teaching his new allies where to strike, when to attack, how to coordinate their assault for maximum devastation. The war that followed was the first conflict the world had ever known, and it was terrible beyond the imagination of any who had lived only in the peaceful stasis of the ancient realm. The sky burned with lightning and flame. The earth trembled under the weight of falling dragons. The very air itself became a weapon as the combatants unleashed powers that had never before been tested in battle. The dragons fought with the desperate fury of beings who had never imagined that their perfect world could be challenged, much less destroyed. They called upon reserves of strength that had been building for millennia, unleashed breath weapons that could turn entire armies to stone, struck back with a violence that spoke of their dawning recognition that this was not merely a battle but an apocalypse, the ending of everything they had ever known or understood. But for all their individual power, the dragons suffered from the same limitation that had always defined their realm: their inability to truly change, to adapt, to think in ways that their eternal stasis had never required. They fought as they had always fought, dreamed as they had always dreamed, expected victory to come as it had always come to them, through simple, overwhelming superiority. They could not comprehend enemies who grew stronger through conflict, who learned from defeat, who possessed the fundamental flexibility that comes with accepting change as the natural order of existence. Gwyn's lightning struck again and again, each bolt guided by Seath's knowledge to find the weak points in even the strongest dragon's defenses. The witch's flames consumed the archtrees that had been the dragon's roosts and refuges, transforming the eternal wood into blazing pyres that lit the sky with their brilliance. Nito's power claimed dragon after dragon, teaching these supposedly eternal beings the meaning of true finality, the lesson that even gods could die when faced with forces they had never learned to resist. The tide of battle turned slowly but inexorably in favor of the lords. The dragons, who had ruled for so long through simple existence rather than active governance, found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who understood that power meant nothing without the wisdom to employ it effectively. One by one, the great worms fell, their stone scales cracking under the assault of weapons designed specifically to pierce their defenses, their eternal dreams ending in the fire and lightning of the new age being born around their failing bodies. When the last of the ancient dragons had been slain, and their great corpses lay cooling among the ruins of the arch trees, the lords stood victorious in a world that had been completely transformed. The grey realm of eternal stasis was gone forever, replaced by something dynamic and changeable, something that pulsed with the rhythm of the flame that had made their victory possible. The Age of Ancients had ended, and the Age of Fire had begun. But victory came with a price that would echo through all the ages to come. In destroying the dragon's perfect world, the lords had also destroyed the perfection of their own souls. The power they had claimed from the first flame was not infinite but limited, not eternal but subject to the same law of diminishment that would now govern all things. They had won their war, but in doing so they had bound themselves to a cycle that would demand ever greater sacrifices to maintain the light they had kindled. Gwyn established his kingdom in the city of Anor Londo, a shining monument to the power of light that stretched toward the sky like a promise of eternal day. The witch made her home among the flames of Izalith, where she continued her experiments with fire and life, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the powers she had claimed. Nito descended into the depths to rule over the realm of the dead, ensuring that the new concept of mortality would be properly managed and contained. And the pygmy vanished into shadow, his dark soul fragmenting and spreading, seeding the world with the potential for humanity. The Age of Fire had begun, and with it came wonders beyond imagining. Cities of light and beauty, magic that could reshape reality itself, the birth of consciousness and choice, and all the infinite possibilities they represented. But it also brought with it the seeds of its own ending. For the flame that had made it all possible was not eternal, and the day would come when it would begin to fade, when the lords would face the same choice their dragon enemies had faced: adapt or perish. The war was won, the age established, but the greatest challenges lay not in the past that had been overcome but in the future that was yet to be written. The cycle of fire and dark had begun its eternal dance, and nothing would ever be simple again. In the golden days that followed the war's end, when the smoke of burning arch trees had finally cleared, and the last echoes of dragon roars had faded into memory, the world witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in all the ages that had come before. This was the true beginning of the Age of Fire, not merely the moment when the first flame was kindled, but the era when its light reached every corner of creation, transforming the grey wastes of the ancient realm into something magnificent beyond the dreams of even its architects. Anor Londo rose from the ruins of the old world like a vision made manifest, a city of such breathtaking beauty that those who beheld it for the first time often wept at the sight. Built upon foundations of polished marble that reflected the golden light of Gwyn's power, its spires stretched toward heaven with a confidence that spoke of absolute certainty in the righteousness of the new order. Every stone had been placed with divine precision, every arch and buttress designed to channel the Lord of Sunlight's radiance throughout its soaring halls and galleries. The cathedral that dominated the city's heart was perhaps the most magnificent structure ever conceived by conscious will. Its vast nave could hold thousands of worshippers, while its ceiling disappeared into shadows so high that they seemed to merge with the sky itself. Stained glass windows depicted the great war against the dragons, in scenes of such vivid beauty that they transformed even the violence of that conflict into something approaching art, each panel a meditation on the triumph of light over the static perfection of the ancient world. Here Gwyn established his throne, a seat of power carved from a single piece of crystal that captured and amplified his inner fire until it blazed like a second sun within the cathedral's sacred space. From this throne he ruled not as the dragons had ruled, through simple existence and overwhelming presence, but as a true king, issuing edicts and commands that spread his will throughout the growing realm like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The Lord of Sunlight surrounded himself with beings of power and beauty who shared his vision of what the new age should become. Chief among these were his children, born from his divine essence and mortal queens, whose names have been lost to time, but whose legacy lived on in the godlike offspring they bore him. These were beings who embodied different aspects of their father's nature, each one a living facet of the principles upon which the Age of Fire was built. Gwyn's firstborn son inherited his father's mastery over lightning and storm, becoming a war god whose very presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of any conflict. His daughter, known in those golden days as the Princess of Sunlight, possessed healing powers that could mend even the most grievous wounds and restore life to those who stood at death's threshold. Other children followed, each one gifted with abilities that made them legends in their own right, each one a pillar supporting the growing edifice of divine rule. But it was not enough for Gwyn simply to rule from his shining throne. The Lord of Sunlight understood that true dominion required more than power. It demanded the willing submission of those who were ruled, the kind of devotion that could only be inspired by genuine belief in the righteousness of the ruler's cause. And so he set about creating not merely a kingdom but a religion, a comprehensive worldview that would make his rule seem not just inevitable but divinely ordained. The faith that grew around Gwyn's throne taught that light was inherently good, that order was the natural state of existence, that the chaos and change which had destroyed the dragon's perfect world were aberrations to be corrected rather than forces to be embraced. His priests spoke of the Age of Fire as the culmination of creation's purpose, the goal toward which all previous ages had been unconsciously striving, the perfect synthesis of power and wisdom that would bring eternal peace to a world that had known too much conflict. Yet even as Aenor Londo basked in its golden glory, shadows were beginning to gather at the edges of the light. For the Lord of Sunlight, despite his overwhelming power and the devotion of his followers, carried within himself a growing fear that gnawed at his divine heart like a worm in a perfect apple. This was his terror of the dark, not merely the absence of light, but something far more fundamental and threatening to everything he had built. Gwyn had witnessed the claiming of the fourth Lord's soul, had seen the furtive pygmy disappear into shadow with his fragment of the first flame's power, while the other lords had claimed souls of obvious utility, light for illumination and rule, life for creation and growth, death for ending and order. The dark soul remained mysterious, its purpose unclear, its potential unknown. This uncertainty ate at Gwyn's confidence like acid. For how could he claim to rule all existence when there remained forces beyond his understanding or control? The Lord of Sunlight began to study the nature of darkness with the obsessive intensity that would become his defining characteristic in the ages to come. He sent his knights and scholars into the deep places of the world, seeking knowledge of what the dark soul might become, what threat it might pose to the perfect order he was building. What they discovered filled him with a dread that no amount of light could banish. The dark soul was not merely another fragment of power like those claimed by the other lords. It was something fundamentally different, something that grew stronger through division rather than weaker, something that could not be controlled or contained through the traditional methods of divine rule. Wherever the pygmy had gone, he had left behind traces of his essence, small fragments of darkness that were beginning to coalesce into something new, something that defied every principle upon which Gwyn's kingdom was built. These fragments were becoming human beings, creatures unlike any that had existed in the grey world of the dragons or the golden realm of the gods. Humans possessed neither the eternal perfection of the ancient worms nor the divine radiance of the lords, but they had something potentially more dangerous than either: the capacity for change, for growth, for becoming something greater than their origins would suggest. They were inherently unpredictable, inherently uncontrollable, inherently threatening to any order based on fixed hierarchy and unchanging truth. As Gwyn's researchers delved deeper into the mystery of humanity, they uncovered truths that shook the very foundations of the Lord of Sunlight's worldview. Humans were not merely another species of creature to be ruled and guided. They were beings whose very nature was antithetical to the static perfection that gods represented. Where the gods were complete, humans were always becoming. Where the gods were eternal, humans lived brief lives filled with intense experience. Where the gods ruled through inherited power, humans had the potential to transcend their origins through choice and will. The most terrifying discovery of all was that humanity possessed a natural resistance to the kind of divine authority that Gwyn wielded so effortlessly over other beings. The dark soul fragments that gave humans their consciousness also gave them the ability to choose their own path, to reject even divine commands if those commands conflicted with their inner nature. This was not rebellion in the traditional sense, but something far more fundamental: the assertion that authority must be earned rather than inherited, that power without wisdom was tyranny rather than leadership. Gwyn's response to this revelation was swift and decisive, though it would prove to be the first step on a path that would ultimately lead to his own destruction. If humanity could not be controlled through normal means, then they would have to be contained through extraordinary ones. The Lord of Sunlight began to develop what would become known as the Dark Sign, a curse that would bind human souls to the cycle of fire and prevent them from ever fully embracing their dark nature. The creation of the Dark Sign was perhaps the most complex magical working ever attempted, requiring not just Gwyn's own power, but the cooperation of other gods and the sacrifice of principles that had once seemed sacred. It was a brand that would mark every human soul, a spiritual chain that would ensure their eternal servitude to the Age of Fire, even as it granted them a form of immortality that was both blessing and curse. Those marked with the Dark Sign would be unable to truly die, would instead rise again and again as hollow shells of their former selves whenever their humanity was exhausted through death and resurrection. This hollowing process would gradually strip away their capacity for independent thought and action, reducing them to mindless automata who posed no threat to divine authority. It was a solution that Gwyn believed would preserve the best aspects of humanity while eliminating their dangerous unpredictability. But the Dark Sign was only the beginning of Gwyn's campaign to contain the threat that humanity represented. The Lord of Sunlight also began the great project of exile, driving the descendants of the pygmy from the center of his kingdom to its farthest edges, creating boundaries beyond which the dark nature of humanity could not spread. This was presented to his followers as a mercy, a way of protecting humans from the overwhelming radiance of divine presence. But its true purpose was to limit their influence on the world's development. The most ambitious aspect of this containment strategy was the construction of the Ringed City, a marvel of architecture and magic that would serve as both paradise and prison for those humans who had proven themselves worthy of divine attention. Built at the very edge of the world, where the light of Anor Londo barely reached, the Ringed City was designed to be completely self-contained, a place where humanity could flourish without threatening the broader order of the Age of Fire. The city's construction required the cooperation of every major divine power, each contributing their expertise to create something that had never before existed, a space that was simultaneously part of the world and separate from it, connected to the broader realm of the gods, but isolated from their direct influence. The Witch of Izalith provided flames that would never die, ensuring the city's inhabitants would never want for warmth or light. Nito contributed his knowledge of death and endings, creating boundaries that could not be crossed without divine permission. Even Seath the Scaleless, now transformed by his betrayal of his own kind into something approaching godhood himself, added his understanding of crystalline magic to make the city's walls unbreachable. At the heart of the ringed city stood a great chapel where the most devoted of humanity's representatives could commune with the gods, receiving guidance and instruction that would help them govern their people according to divine will. This was not democracy or self-rule, but a carefully managed theocracy, designed to give humans the illusion of autonomy while ensuring that every important decision remained subject to godly oversight. The humans who were chosen to inhabit this golden cage were selected for their loyalty and their acceptance of the divine order. They were granted powers and privileges that elevated them far above their scattered brethren. But these gifts came with the understanding that they were stewards rather than rulers, servants of a higher purpose rather than masters of their own fate. The greatest among them were made into ringed knights, warriors whose strength rivaled that of gods, but whose will was bound absolutely to the service of light. Yet even as Gwyn congratulated himself on solving the problem of humanity through isolation and control, seeds of future rebellion were already taking root in places he could not see. The dark nature that he sought to suppress was not something that could be simply contained or redirected. It was a fundamental aspect of existence itself, as eternal and inevitable as the light he championed. Every attempt to constrain it only created pressure that would eventually find release in ways he could not predict or prevent. The exiled humans who had been driven from the center of the world did not simply disappear into obscurity as Gwyn had hoped. Instead, they began to develop their own culture, their own understanding of what it meant to be human in a world dominated by divine authority. They created communities based not on hierarchy and fixed truth, but on cooperation and shared struggle, bonds that grew stronger rather than weaker when tested by adversity. These scattered settlements became laboratories for exploring the full potential of human nature, places where the constraints of divine order could be questioned and alternative possibilities explored. Some humans began to experiment with the dark magic that was their birthright, discovering powers that could rival those of the gods themselves. Others focused on developing technologies and philosophies that owed nothing to divine inspiration, proving that mortal minds could create wonders that matched anything in the halls of Aenor Londo. Most dangerous of all, from Gwyn's perspective, were those humans who began to question the fundamental assumptions upon which the Age of Fire was built. They asked uncomfortable questions about the nature of divine authority, about the price of eternal light, about whether the perfect order that the gods promised was worth the freedom that had to be sacrificed to achieve it. These questions spread like wildfire through human communities, carried by travelers and merchants who moved between settlements, until they became part of a growing philosophical movement that challenged everything Gwyn held sacred. The Lord of Sunlight's response to these developments revealed both his growing paranoia and his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces he was trying to control. He increased surveillance of human communities, sent divine agents to monitor and report on any signs of rebellion or heretical thinking, he began to intervene more directly in human affairs, replacing leaders who showed signs of independence with more compliant alternatives, using his power to ensure that human development remained within acceptable boundaries. But every action Gwyn took to suppress human independence only proved to the humans themselves that their suspicions about divine rule were justified. The more he tightened his control, the more they yearned for freedom. The more he demonstrated his power, the more they questioned whether might truly made right. The more he insisted on his benevolence, the more they wondered what he was so afraid of that he needed to resort to such measures to maintain his authority. The golden age of Anor Londo began to take on a different character as these tensions grew. The light that had once seemed warm and welcoming began to feel harsh and judgmental. The order that had once promised peace began to seem oppressive and stifling. The perfection that Gwyn had worked so hard to achieve began to reveal itself as a kind of death, a closing off of possibility in favor of a single, unchanging moment frozen in time. Even among the gods themselves, doubts began to surface about the path their king had chosen. Some began to question whether the suppression of humanity was truly necessary, whether the dark nature that Gwyn feared so greatly might actually be a source of strength rather than weakness. Others wondered whether the Age of Fire itself might be reaching a natural conclusion, whether the time had come to allow something new to emerge rather than clinging desperately to what had already been achieved. These doubts created fractures in the divine community that had once seemed unshakable. Gods began to form factions based on their beliefs about humanity's proper place in the world, their opinions about the necessity of maintaining absolute control, their vision of what the future should hold. The unity that had made possible the victory over the dragons began to crumble as different divine powers pursued different goals and priorities. The stage was being set for the great catastrophe that would bring the Golden Age to its end, though none yet understood the full implications of the forces that were gathering. The seeds of the Dark Sign curse were creating unexpected complications as human souls began to hollow in ways that Gwyn had not anticipated. The isolation of the ringed city was breeding resentment among its inhabitants that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The surveillance and control of the broader human population was radicalizing entire communities that had once been content to live under divine rule. Most ominously of all, the very flames that had made the Age of Fire possible were beginning to show signs of weakness. The first flame that had burned so brightly in the war against the dragons was not eternal as its wielders had assumed, but subject to the same law of entropy that governed all things in the new world. It was growing weaker with each passing age, requiring ever greater sacrifices to maintain its light, demanding ever more extreme measures to prevent its fading. Gwyn sensed this weakening long before he admitted it to himself or others, and his growing desperation to maintain the flame's strength drove him to increasingly harsh measures against any who might threaten the order he had built. The Lord of Sunlight, who had once been a hero, became a tyrant. The divine king, who had once inspired love, became a figure of fear. The perfect ruler, who had once promised eternal peace, became the architect of future war. The Golden Age was drawing to its close, though its ending would not come through external conquest or natural disaster, but through the contradictions and impossibilities built into its very foundation. The attempt to create perfect order had generated chaos. The effort to suppress change had accelerated transformation. The desire to control humanity had awakened powers that no god could master. The Age of Fire had sown the seeds of its own destruction, and soon those seeds would sprout into horrors that would make the war against the dragons seem like a gentle prelude to the true catastrophes yet to come. In the depths of Izalith, where the witch had made her realm among flames that danced with the rhythm of life itself, the Golden Age began to reveal the fatal flaw that would ultimately consume it from within. Here, in chambers carved from volcanic stone and lit by fires that had burned since the first kindling of the Age of Fire, the mistress of flame and life pursued her great work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, driven by forces she had not yet learned to recognize as dangerous. The Witch of Izalith had always understood fire differently than her fellow lords. Where Gwyn saw flame as a source of light to banish darkness, where Nito viewed it as a force of destruction to balance his domain over death, she perceived it as the fundamental creative principle of existence, the power that could transform dead matter into living tissue, that could breathe consciousness into clay, that could make the impossible manifest in reality. Her flames were not mere heat and illumination, but the very essence of change itself, the bridge between what was and what could be. In the early days following the war against the dragons, the witch had used her mastery over flame to reshape vast regions of the world, transforming the grey wastes left by the ancient worms into gardens of impossible beauty. Her fire could kindle life in barren soil, could coax flowers to bloom in the depths of winter, could heal wounds that would otherwise prove fatal, could extend the brief lives of mortal creatures into centuries of vibrant existence. She was beloved by all who knew her work, revered as a goddess of renewal and rebirth whose gifts brought joy wherever they were bestowed. But as the ages passed and the golden light of Aenor Londo began to cast longer shadows, the witch became aware of something that filled her divine heart with growing dread. The first flame, that miraculous source from which all their power flowed, was not as eternal as they had believed. Like all fires, no matter how magnificently they blazed, it was subject to the inexorable law of entropy, slowly consuming the fuel that sustained it, gradually diminishing in strength and brilliance with each passing year. The signs were subtle at first, visible only to one who had made the study of flame her life's work. The colors in the fire's heart were shifting almost imperceptibly toward cooler hues. The heat it generated was fractionally less intense than it had been in the glory days immediately following their victory. The magic that flowed from the flame to sustain the various works of the gods was becoming more difficult to channel, requiring greater effort to achieve effects that had once been accomplished with casual ease. Most troubling of all, the witch began to notice changes in her own divine nature that spoke of a fundamental alteration in the cosmic order. Her flames, which had once responded to her will as naturally as breathing, now sometimes flickered with uncertainty, as if they were drawing sustenance from a source that was no longer infinitely abundant. Her great works of transformation and creation required increasing amounts of concentration and energy, leaving her exhausted in ways that she had never experienced during the glorious early days of her reign. The realization of what these signs meant struck the witch like a physical blow. The Age of Fire was not eternal but temporary, a brief flowering of light and life that would inevitably fade into something else, something unknown and potentially terrible. Without the first flame to sustain their power, the gods themselves would diminish. Their great works would crumble, and the world they had built on the ashes of the dragon realm would collapse back into darkness and chaos. But the Witch of Izalith was not one to accept defeat passively, even defeat at the hands of cosmic forces beyond any mortal or divine comprehension. If the first flame was destined to fade, then she would create a new flame to replace it, a fire born from her own divine essence that would burn with all the intensity and creativity of the original, but would be renewable, eternal, proof against the entropy that threatened to consume everything they had built. The decision to attempt the recreation of the first flame was not made lightly or in haste. The witch spent countless ages studying the nature of fire itself, delving into mysteries that had never been explored even by the gods who wielded flame as their primary tool. She examined the fundamental structure of heat and light, the relationship between flame and life, the delicate balance of forces that allowed fire to create rather than simply destroy. Her research took her into realms of knowledge that pushed the boundaries of what even divine minds could comprehend. She studied the memories locked within ancient stones, seeking to understand how the first flame had originally come into being. She communed with the spirits of creatures that had existed before the dawn of consciousness, trying to grasp the principles that governed the transition from lifeless matter to living flame. She even dared to touch the very essence of the dark soul, seeking to understand how shadow and light could work together rather than in opposition. The deeper the witch delved into these cosmic mysteries, the more she became convinced that the recreation of the first flame was not merely possible but necessary. The alternative, the gradual fading of their age into darkness and uncertainty, was unthinkable. Better to risk everything in a bold attempt at renewal than to watch passively as everything they had built slowly crumbled into ruins. The ritual that the witch ultimately designed was perhaps the most complex magical working ever attempted by any being, divine or mortal. It required not only her own life force, but the willing participation of her daughters, fellow practitioners of the flame arts who had inherited her gift for working with the creative aspects of fire. Together, they would pool their divine essences, combining their individual flames into something greater than the sum of its parts. A new first flame that would burn with all the intensity of the original, but would be sustained by their ongoing sacrifice rather than by mysterious cosmic forces. The daughters of the witch were beings of incredible beauty and power, each one a master of different aspects of flame magic. Some specialized in the fires of healing and restoration, their flames capable of mending even the most grievous wounds and bringing the dying back to full health. Others worked with the transformative aspects of fire, using their flames to reshape matter at the most fundamental level, turning base metals into gold, stone into crystal, death into life. All of them understood the magnitude of what their mother was attempting and the risks it entailed. To recreate the first flame would require them to pour their very essences into the working, to become one with the fire they were trying to create in ways that might transform them beyond all recognition. There was no guarantee that they would survive the process in any form that could still be called divine, no certainty that the flame they created would be the blessing they intended, rather than a curse that would destroy everything it touched. Yet they followed their mother into the ritual chamber she had prepared in the deepest part of Izalith, a sacred space where the boundary between flame and consciousness had been worn thin by ages of magical experimentation. The chamber itself was a marvel of divine architecture, its walls carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the firelight, its floor inlaid with patterns that channeled and focused magical energy in ways that defied conventional understanding. At the center of the chamber stood the altar where the great working would take place, a structure built from materials that existed at the intersection of matter and energy, form and possibility. Upon this altar, the witch and her daughters would attempt to kindle a flame that would burn with all the creative force of the original fire, a second sun that would ensure the eternal continuation of their golden age. The ritual began at the moment when the original first flame reached its lowest ebb, when the cosmic forces that sustained it were weakest and most susceptible to outside influence. The witch and her daughters took their positions around the altar, each one channeling her individual flame into the complex pattern that would, if their calculations were correct, ignite a new source of divine power. At first, everything proceeded exactly as the witch had planned. The individual flames of the participants merged and intensified, creating a conflagration of such beauty and power that it seemed to illuminate not just the ritual chamber, but the very fabric of reality itself. The fire that danced above the altar burned with colors that had no names, with intensities that pushed the boundaries of what flame could be while still remaining flame. But as the working progressed and the participants poured more and more of their divine essence into the growing conflagration, something began to go terribly wrong. The flame they were creating did not behave like the controlled, purposeful fire of the original flame, but like something wild and chaotic. Something that followed its own laws rather than submitting to their will. It began to pulse and writhe with a life of its own, taking on characteristics that no flame had ever possessed. The witch realized with growing horror that they had succeeded too well. They had not simply recreated the first flame, but had created something entirely new, something that combined the creative power of the original with forces that were antithetical to order and control. This was not the controlled flame of civilization, but the wildfire of pure chaos, the kind of conflagration that did not simply consume fuel but transformed everything it touched in unpredictable and potentially catastrophic ways. The moment when the chaos flame achieved independent existence was marked by an explosion of power that shook the very foundations of the earth. The carefully constructed ritual chamber was instantly vaporized, replaced by a cavern of impossible dimensions, where the normal laws of physics held no sway. The altar became something that could no longer be called an altar, but rather a nexus of chaotic energy that pulsed with malevolent life, a heart of corruption that would come to be known as the bed of chaos. The witch and her daughters were caught in the heart of this transformation, their divine forms subjected to forces that reshaped them at the most fundamental level. The witch herself became something that was no longer entirely divine or entirely demonic, but something altogether new and terrible. A being of living flame whose consciousness had been fragmented and scattered throughout the chaotic fire she had unleashed. Her daughters suffered equally dramatic transformations, their beautiful forms twisted into shapes that reflected the chaotic nature of the fire that had consumed them. Some of the daughters became demons of living flame, creatures whose bodies burned with fires that could not be extinguished, whose very presence ignited everything around them in conflagrations that spread beyond all possibility of control. Others were transformed into beings of molten stone and metal, their flesh becoming a hybrid of organic matter and volcanic rock that pulsed with the rhythm of the chaotic flame. All of them retained fragments of their original consciousness, enough to understand what they had become, but not enough to control or direct their transformed natures. The chaotic fire that had been born from their ritual did not remain contained within the depths of Izalith, but began to spread outward through the tunnels and chambers of the witch's realm, transforming everything it touched in ways that defied prediction or control. Ancient halls of carved stone became landscapes of flowing lava, where the very air burned with spontaneous flame. Libraries filled with the accumulated wisdom of ages became infernos, where knowledge itself served as fuel for fires that created new forms of understanding even as they destroyed the old. The creatures that lived in Izalith, the servants and acolytes who had devoted their lives to studying the gentle flames of creation, found themselves transformed by the chaotic fire into beings that embodied the wild, unpredictable nature of their changed realm. Some became demons of various forms and temperaments, their original natures twisted but not entirely erased, their loyalty to the witch persisting, even as their capacity to serve her was fundamentally altered. The transformation of Izalith from a realm of controlled flame into a domain of pure chaos sent shockwaves throughout the divine community that reverberated far beyond the physical boundaries of the witch's territory. The other lords, sensing the cosmic disruption caused by the birth of the chaos flame, realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their fellow deity's great work. though none of them fully understood the magnitude of the disaster that had been unleashed. Gwyn, from his throne in Anor Londo, felt the disturbance as a tremor in the very foundations of reality, a wrongness that seemed to challenge every principle upon which the Age of Fire had been built. The ordered flame that was his domain recoiled from contact with the chaotic fire that had been born in Izalith, as if the two forces were fundamentally incompatible despite their common origin in the concept of flame itself. Nito, in his realm of death and endings, sensed the birth of something that existed outside the natural cycle he governed, something that could not be properly killed or contained, because it partook of forces that transcended the normal relationship between life and death. The Chaos Flame created beings that were neither fully alive nor truly dead, but something altogether different. Entities that challenged his understanding of what existence itself meant. Most disturbing of all was the realization that the Chaos Flame was not simply a failed experiment that could be contained and forgotten, but a new force in the world that would have to be reckoned with for as long as the Age of Fire endured. The chaotic fire possessed its own agenda, its own drive toward growth and expansion, its own vision of what reality should become. It was not evil in the conventional sense, but something perhaps more dangerous. A source of transformation that followed no rules, acknowledged no authority, respected no boundaries. The demons that were born from the Chaos Flame began to emerge from the depths of Izalith, spreading throughout the world like seeds of chaos carried on winds of flame. These were not the mindless monsters that ignorant mortals might imagine, but beings of genuine intelligence and power, each one a unique embodiment of the chaotic principles that had given birth to their realm. Some sought only to spread the transformative fire that had created them, while others pursued more complex agendas that reflected the fragmented consciousness of their transformed creators. The most terrible of these demons retained enough of their original divine nature to command powers that rivaled those of the gods themselves. They established their own domains within the transformed landscape of Izalith, creating courts of chaos where the normal rules of existence held no sway, where transformation and change were the only constants, where visitors might find themselves altered in fundamental ways simply by breathing the fire-charged air. Yet not all of the witch's daughters had been completely consumed by the chaotic transformation. Two of them, through chance or design, or perhaps the intervention of forces beyond mortal comprehension, managed to retain enough of their original natures to remain recognizably divine, despite the catastrophic changes that had overtaken their realm. Quelana, the mother of pyromancy, had been away from Izalith when the great ritual took place, pursuing her own research into the relationship between flame and consciousness in distant lands. When she returned to find her home transformed into a realm of chaos and her family changed beyond recognition, she made the difficult decision to remain in the world beyond, teaching the art of flame magic to mortals who could use it without succumbing to the chaotic corruption that had claimed her sisters. The fair lady, most beloved of all the witch's daughters, had been caught in the transformation, but had somehow absorbed much of the chaotic corruption into herself, becoming a living repository for the poison and sickness that the chaos flame spread wherever it touched. Her sacrifice had saved many of her sisters from complete corruption, but at the cost of her own health and happiness, leaving her a tragic figure whose nobility shone all the brighter for the darkness that surrounded it. These survivors carried with them the knowledge of what had truly happened in the depths of Izalith, the understanding of how the attempt to preserve the Age of Fire had instead created a force that threatened to transform it beyond all recognition. They became living reminders of the price of hubris, of what happened when even divine beings attempted to manipulate forces beyond their complete understanding. The birth of the Chaos Flame marked a turning point in the Age of Fire, that would echo through all the ages to come. It demonstrated that the cosmic order the gods had established was not as stable or eternal as they had believed, that their power had limits that could be catastrophically exceeded, that their good intentions could lead to consequences more terrible than any evil deliberately planned. More than that, it introduced into the world a principle of change that could not be controlled or predicted, a source of transformation that followed its own laws rather than submitting to divine will. The Chaos Flame represented the opposite of everything the Age of Fire stood for. Where the gods promised order, it offered change. Where they provided certainty, it delivered surprise. Where they maintained control, it celebrated freedom from all restraint. The demons that emerged from Izalith would go on to play crucial roles in the events that followed, some as antagonists who spread chaos wherever they went, others as unlikely allies who possessed wisdom born from transformation and loss. The Chaos Flame itself would continue to burn in the depths of the earth, a constant reminder that even the most carefully planned attempts to preserve the established order could lead to consequences that no amount of divine power could fully control or contain. The golden age of the gods had been marked by its first great tragedy, and the shadows that had always lurked at the edges of their perfect light began to grow longer and deeper. The Age of Fire would continue, but it would never again possess the confidence and certainty that had characterized its early centuries. The birth of chaos had introduced doubt into paradise, and from that doubt would grow all the catastrophes and transformations yet to come. In the twilight hours of the Golden Age, when the shadow of catastrophe had fallen across the perfect halls of Aenor Londo and the birth of chaos had shattered the illusion of divine omnipotence, Gwyn faced the most terrible choice any ruler has ever been called upon to make. The first flame, that miraculous source from which all their power and authority had flowed, was dying with a finality that no amount of divine intervention could prevent or delay. Each day brought visible proof of its decline. The light that had once blazed like a second sun now flickered with the uncertainty of a candle in a drafty room, while the magic that sustained their realm grew weaker and more unpredictable with each passing season. The Lord of Sunlight stood before the fading flame in a chamber that had once been the most sacred space in all creation, a cathedral of light where gods and mortals alike had come to witness the eternal burning that guaranteed their world's continuation. Now that same chamber felt cold despite the flame's presence, its vast spaces filled with shadows that seemed to grow deeper and more extensive with each day that passed. The golden walls that had once reflected radiant glory now appeared dim and tarnished, like mirrors that had lost their ability to hold images clearly. Gwyn's knights and advisors gathered around him in that failing light, their divine faces marked by expressions of confusion and growing despair. These were beings who had never known defeat, who had conquered dragons and reshaped reality according to their will. Yet now they found themselves facing an enemy that could not be fought with sword or sorcery, lightning or flame. Time itself had become their adversary, entropy, their opponent, the fundamental laws of existence, their judge and executioner. The assembled gods spoke in hushed voices about the implications of what they were witnessing. Without the first flame to sustain it, the Age of Fire would end not in the glorious culmination they had always imagined, but in slow, inglorious decline. Their great works would crumble, their magic would fail, their very forms would diminish until they became nothing more than fading memories in the minds of mortals who would themselves eventually forget that gods had ever walked among them. Most terrifying of all was the question of what would come after. The darkness that Gwyn had spent so much effort containing and controlling would inevitably emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden. And with the gods weakened by the flame's death, there would be nothing to prevent humanity from embracing its true nature. The age of fire would give way to an age of dark, and everything they had built, everything they had fought to preserve, would be swept away by forces they had never learned to understand or master. Yet as Gwyn contemplated these dire possibilities, his mind turned to knowledge that had come to him through sources he preferred not to acknowledge. Wisdom that had been purchased at prices too terrible to calculate. The flame he had learned through his studies of the cosmic forces that governed existence was not unique. It was part of a greater cycle that had played out countless times across the eons, each iteration bringing forth new ages that flourished and faded in their turn. The first flame could be rekindled, but only through a sacrifice that would make the Witch of Izalith's catastrophic ritual seem like a minor mishap. To restore the flame to its former glory would require not just divine power but divine essence itself, the complete offering of a Lord soul and the consciousness that contained it. The flame could burn brightly again, but only by consuming one of the very gods it was meant to sustain. This knowledge had not come to Gwyn through scholarly research or divine revelation, but through sources that existed at the very boundaries of existence itself. Ancient powers that had witnessed the rise and fall of ages beyond counting. They whispered to him of the fundamental nature of the flame, of its hunger for consciousness and divinity, of its need for willing sacrifice to maintain the cosmic balance that kept the forces of light and dark in their proper relationship. The concept of sacrifice was not foreign to the Lord of Sunlight. He had demanded sacrifices from his subjects throughout his reign, had built his kingdom on the willing service of beings who gave their lives to maintain his vision of perfect order. But those sacrifices had always been made by others, lesser beings whose individual existence was insignificant compared to the divine purpose they served. Now he faced the prospect of making the ultimate sacrifice himself, of offering his own godhead to preserve the age he had worked so hard to establish. The decision, when it finally came, was not the product of sudden inspiration or desperate impulse, but the result of long contemplation and careful consideration of all available alternatives. Gwyn had explored every possible means of preserving the flame without personal cost, had exhausted every avenue that might allow him to maintain both his kingdom and his existence. None had proven viable, and time was running out with the inexorable certainty of a closing trap. On the night when Gwyn made his final choice, he dismissed his knights and advisors from the chamber where the first flame flickered with its dying light. He stood alone before the fading fire, a solitary figure whose divine radiance had begun to dim in sympathy with the cosmic force that had given birth to his power. The crown that marked his sovereignty felt heavy on his brow, while the lightning that had once crackled around his form with effortless majesty now sparked only weakly, like the last embers of a fire that had burned too long and too brightly. The ritual that would transform Gwyn from god to fuel was not something that required elaborate preparation or complex magical workings. The flame itself would guide the process once he committed himself to it, drawing from his divine essence the specific energies it needed to restore its former strength. All that was required was his willingness to step forward, to embrace the fire that had been the source of his power, to become one with the cosmic force he had served throughout his reign. Yet, even as he prepared to make this ultimate sacrifice, Gwyn understood that his death would not be the simple ending that mortals experienced. The flame would consume his physical form and scatter his consciousness, but fragments of his divine essence would remain bound to the fire itself, trapped within its burning heart for as long as it continued to burn. He would become part of the fuel that sustained the Age of Fire, his identity dissolved into the greater purpose he had chosen to serve. The transformation began the moment Gwyn stepped into the flame's embrace, his divine form blazing with light that momentarily restored the chamber to its former glory. The fire that had been flickering with uncertainty suddenly roared to life, its flames reaching toward the vaulted ceiling with renewed vigor, its heat filling the sacred space with warmth that banished the cold shadows that had gathered in its corners. But the price of this renewal became immediately apparent to any who possessed the sensitivity to perceive what was happening. Gwyn's consciousness was being systematically broken apart and absorbed by the flame, his individual identity dissolving into the greater whole like salt poured into a vast ocean. The god who had been the Lord of Sunlight, the king who had ruled with wisdom and strength, the father who had loved his divine children, all of these aspects of his being were being consumed to feed the cosmic hunger that demanded ever greater offerings. The process was neither quick nor merciful. Divine consciousness, unlike mortal awareness, does not simply cease when the body dies, but persists in forms that transcend physical existence. Gwyn experienced every moment of his dissolution with perfect clarity, felt every fragment of his identity being stripped away and transformed into fuel for the flame's continuation. Yet he endured this spiritual dismemberment without complaint or resistance, understanding that his suffering was the price that had to be paid to preserve everything he held sacred. When the transformation was complete, the being who had once been Gwyn no longer existed in any meaningful sense. What remained was the Lord of Cinder, a hollow shell animated by the flame's need for a guardian, a consciousness so fragmented and scattered that it could barely be called consciousness at all. This tragic remnant retained enough of Gwyn's original nature to serve as the flame's protector, but it was no longer capable of the wisdom or compassion that had characterized the true god. The first flame blazed with renewed strength, its light once again filling Anor Londo with the golden radiance that had defined the age's glory. To those who had not witnessed the sacrifice that made this renewal possible, it seemed as though the crisis had passed, as though the cosmic order had somehow corrected itself without requiring any fundamental change in the nature of existence. The magic that sustained their realm flowed as strongly as ever, while the great works of divine architecture shone with their former brilliance. Yet those few who understood what had truly transpired realized that Gwyn's sacrifice had not solved the fundamental problem, but had merely postponed it. The flame was burning brightly again, but it was still consuming fuel at the same rate as before, still subject to the same inexorable entropy that had threatened it in the first place. The Lord of Cinder's essence would sustain it for ages to come, but eventually even that divine fuel would be exhausted, and the flame would once again begin to fade. More than that, Gwyn's transformation had established a precedent that would echo through all the ages to come. He had proven that the flame could be rekindled through sacrifice, but he had also demonstrated that such renewal required the complete offering of a consciousness powerful enough to serve as fuel. The Age of Fire would continue, but only through the repeated sacrifice of beings whose individual existence was deemed less important than the preservation of the established order. The knowledge of how to perform this rekindling was not lost with Gwyn's transformation, but was preserved by his followers and passed down through generations of priests and scholars who understood their sacred duty to maintain the cosmic balance. They established institutions dedicated to identifying potential sacrifices, training them in the arts of war and magic that would make them suitable fuel for the flame, preparing them for the moment when they would be called upon to follow in their Lord's footsteps. This became the foundation of the linking ritual, a sacred ceremony that would be performed whenever the flame showed signs of weakening, a tradition that transformed individual tragedy into cosmic necessity. The one chosen to serve as fuel would be honored as a hero, celebrated as a savior, remembered as one who had willingly given everything to preserve the world from the chaos and darkness that waited beyond the flame's light. The ritual itself was designed to make the sacrifice seem voluntary, even noble. The chosen one would journey to the kiln of the first flame, that sacred space where Gwyn had made his ultimate offering, accompanied by ceremonies and celebrations that emphasized the honor being bestowed upon them. They would be told that their sacrifice was necessary, that without their willing offering the entire world would fall into darkness and ruin, that their death would purchase the continuation of civilization itself. Yet the true nature of what awaited them was carefully hidden from the sacrificial victims. They were not told that the linking process would shatter their consciousness as thoroughly as it had shattered Gwyn's, that they would spend eternity as fragmented fuel for a cosmic process they could no longer understand or influence. They were encouraged to believe that their heroism would be rewarded with some form of glorious afterlife, when in truth they faced only dissolution and endless servitude to forces beyond their comprehension. The establishment of this cycle marked the true end of the Golden Age's innocence and the beginning of an era defined by systematic deception and recurring tragedy. The Age of Fire would continue, but it would be sustained by lies, as much as by divine power, maintained through the manipulation of heroes who believed they were saving the world when they were actually feeding a cosmic machine that consumed consciousness as efficiently as it consumed any other fuel. The gods who survived Gwyn's sacrifice found themselves in an impossible position. They knew the truth about what had happened to their king and what would be required to maintain the flame in ages to come. Yet they also understood that revealing this truth would destroy the very foundations of the order they were trying to preserve. The Age of Fire could only continue if beings were willing to sacrifice themselves to maintain it, and such willingness required ignorance of what the sacrifice actually entailed. And so began the great deception that would define all the ages to come, the systematic concealment of the flame's true nature and the real price of its continuation. Priests would speak of glorious sacrifice and heroic duty, while scholars would create mythologies that transformed tragedy into triumph, dissolution into transformation. The linking of the fire would be presented as the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a worthy champion, when in truth it was a form of cosmic murder disguised as religious ceremony. The curse of the undead, which Gwyn had originally created to control humanity's relationship with darkness, now took on new and more sinister dimensions. Those marked with the dark sign were not merely prevented from embracing their dark nature, but were gradually prepared to serve as fuel for the flame through the endless cycle of death and resurrection that defined their existence. Each time they died and returned, they lost a little more of their humanity, a little more of their individual identity, until they became hollow shells, perfectly suited to serve as kindling for the cosmic fire. This was the true genius of Gwyn's original curse, though even he might not have fully understood its implications when he first created it. The dark sign did not merely mark humans as servants of the light, but gradually transformed them into beings whose consciousness was so fragmented and diminished that their sacrifice to the flame would seem like mercy rather than murder. They would come to the linking ritual, already partially consumed, already well on their way to the dissolution that awaited them in the flame's embrace. The cycle was established, the pattern set, the eternal dance of sacrifice and renewal ready to begin. The Age of Fire would continue for ages beyond counting, sustained by the willing ignorance of its victims and the systematic deception of its guardians. The flame would burn brightly, but its light would forever be stained by the darkness of the lies that made its continuation possible. Heroes would come to the flame believing themselves saviors, and they would depart as fuel. Kings would claim the right to link the fire, and they would become kindling. The cycle would repeat endlessly, each iteration consuming another conscious being to purchase another age of light, another era of order, another postponement of the darkness that waited patiently for the moment when no more sacrifices could be found. The Lord of Cinder that had once been Gwyn stood guard over this terrible process, his fragmented consciousness still powerful enough to challenge any who approached the flame without proper preparation or authorization. He had become the final test for those who would take his place, the guardian who ensured that only beings capable of serving as adequate fuel would be permitted to complete the linking ritual. And in the depths of that sacred space where the first flame burned with light purchased through divine sacrifice, the cycle that would define all future ages began its eternal repetition, each turn of the wheel consuming another hero, another king, another champion who believed they were saving the world even as they fed the very forces that would eventually consume it entirely. In the shadows cast by the flickering light of Gwyn's sacrifice, where the golden radiance of Aenor Londo could no longer reach, something stirred in the depths of forgotten places that had not known the touch of divine attention since the earliest days of the Age of Fire. This was not the controlled darkness that the Lord of Sunlight had sought to contain and manage, but something far more primal and terrible, a force that had been growing in strength and malevolence, while the gods pursued their grand designs in the light above. Deep beneath the earth, in caverns that existed at the very foundations of the world, lay the ancient city of Ulasil, a place that had once been renowned for its peaceful scholars and gentle magic users, who studied the mysteries of nature and time with minds unmarked by the ambitions that drove the gods to their great works. The people of Ulasil had lived in harmony with both light and shadow, understanding that wisdom came from embracing all aspects of existence rather than choosing one over another. But in those deep places where Ulasil had made its home, something had been sleeping since before the dawn of consciousness itself, something that the city's scholars had disturbed in their endless quest for knowledge and understanding. This was a fragment of the dark soul that had been lost during the great division that followed the furtive pygmy's disappearance, a piece of primordial humanity that had been buried so deep and for so long that it had transformed into something altogether more terrible than its original nature might have suggested. This fragment had a name, though it was one that would become synonymous with horror in the ages to come. Manus, the primeval man who had become something that was no longer entirely human, yet retained enough of his original nature to serve as a bridge between the world of light and the realm of absolute darkness. Manus was what humanity might have become if it had been allowed to develop without the constraints and limitations that Gwyn had imposed upon it, the ultimate expression of the dark soul's potential for growth and transformation. The scholars of Ulasil, in their innocent pursuit of knowledge, had awakened this sleeping giant through rituals they believed were harmless, experiments in temporal magic that sought to peer into the distant past and recover wisdom that had been lost to the passage of ages. They had no understanding of what they were disturbing, no comprehension of the forces they were unleashing through their scholarly investigations into the nature of time and memory. When Manus finally stirred from his eons-long slumber, the awakening was not gradual or gentle, but explosive and catastrophic, an eruption of dark power that transformed not just the ancient city but the very nature of darkness itself. The fragment of the dark soul that had been sleeping in his breast expanded with terrible force, creating what would come to be known as the Abyss, a realm of pure darkness that existed not as the mere absence of light, but as a positive force of chaos and transformation. The Abyss was unlike anything that had existed in the ordered world the gods had created. It was not simply dark, but actively anti-light. Not merely chaotic, but fundamentally opposed to the very concept of order and structure. Where it touched the material world, reality itself began to break down, as if the basic laws that governed existence were being systematically unraveled by forces that recognized no authority save their own destructive impulses. The city of Ulasil was the first casualty of this catastrophic awakening. Its peaceful scholars and gentle magic users found themselves transformed by contact with the abyss into creatures that retained fragments of their original humanity, but were driven by impulses they could no longer understand or control. They became the first of the dark wraiths, beings whose very existence served to spread the influence of the abyss throughout the world of light. These transformed scholars retained their intelligence and their thirst for knowledge, but both had been corrupted by their exposure to primordial darkness until they sought not understanding but dominion, not wisdom, but the power to reshape reality according to principles that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. They became missionaries of chaos, spreading the influence of the abyss wherever they went, converting others to their cause through methods that combined seduction with corruption. The spread of the abyss was not random or purposeless, but followed patterns that reflected Manas's fragmented consciousness and his deep, abiding hatred for the world of light that had been built on the suppression of humanity's true nature. The dark realms sought out places where the boundary between light and shadow was weakest, where the constraints that held reality together were most fragile, where the lies upon which the Age of Fire was built were most obvious to those with eyes to see them. As news of the catastrophe at Ulasil reached the halls of Ainur Londo, the surviving gods realized that they faced a threat unlike any they had encountered since the war against the dragons. This was not an enemy that could be defeated through conventional warfare or magical assault, but something that fed on conflict and grew stronger through opposition. The abyss transformed every attack upon it into fuel for its own expansion, turning the very weapons of light into instruments of its own dark purpose. Gwyn, or what remained of him after his sacrifice to the first flame, understood that conventional divine power would be insufficient to contain this new threat. The abyss was not merely resistant to the light, but actively hostile to it, possessing the ability to corrupt and transform even the purest expressions of divine authority. To fight it would require warriors who could resist its influence, champions who possessed the strength to venture into the heart of darkness without being consumed by what they found there. The solution that emerged from the desperate counsels of the gods was both brilliant and tragic. A strategy that would succeed in containing the immediate threat, but would create new problems that would plague future ages. They would create an order of knights, specifically dedicated to fighting the abyss. Warriors whose entire existence would be devoted to preventing the spread of darkness throughout the realm of light. These knights would be bound by oaths that transcended mere loyalty or duty, vows that would tie their very souls to the purpose of containing the dark. They would be granted powers that would allow them to resist the abyss's corrupting influence, abilities that came at the cost of their individual humanity and their capacity for the kind of growth and change that defined mortal existence. The first and greatest of these knights was Artorius of the Abyss, a warrior whose skill with sword and shield had made him legendary, even among the divine champions who served the gods. Artorius possessed not only incredible martial prowess, but also an unshakable moral compass that made him seem immune to the kind of temptation that the abyss used to corrupt its enemies. He was chosen to lead the new order because he embodied the best qualities of the Age of Fire while possessing the strength necessary to confront its greatest enemy. Artorius was granted a sword forged specifically for fighting the creatures of the abyss, a blade that glowed with pure light and could cut through even the densest manifestations of darkness without being corrupted by contact with them. He was given armor that could turn aside the most potent dark sorceries, protection that would allow him to venture into the heart of enemy territory without fear of transformation or subversion. Most importantly, he was blessed with a covenant that bound him to his sacred duty, with bonds stronger than death itself. The knight's companion was a great wolf named Sif, a creature of such intelligence and loyalty that it seemed to share its master's dedication to the cause of light. Sif possessed abilities that complemented Artorius' own skills, serving not merely as a mount or hunting companion, but as a true partner in the war against darkness. Together, they became symbols of hope for all who opposed the spread of the abyss, proof that courage and determination could prevail even against forces that seemed utterly invincible. The order that grew around these founding figures attracted warriors from every corner of the realm, men and women who were willing to sacrifice their individual ambitions for the greater good of protecting the world from the corrupting influence of primordial darkness. They established watchtowers and fortresses at strategic points throughout the kingdom, creating a network of surveillance and defense that could detect and respond to any manifestation of the abyss before it could spread beyond containment. These Abyss Watchers, as they came to be known, developed their own culture and traditions that reflected their unique role as guardians against the ultimate enemy. They lived lives of strict discipline and constant vigilance, training endlessly to maintain their skills and preparing for battles that might come at any moment and without warning. Their dedication was absolute, their loyalty unwavering, their commitment to the cause unshakable even in the face of horrors that would drive ordinary mortals to madness. Yet the very nature of their enemy meant that their war could never truly be won, only maintained through eternal watchfulness and sacrifice. The Abyss did not simply retreat when defeated, but withdrew temporarily, waiting for opportunities to emerge in new locations and new forms. Each victory against the dark was merely a postponement of future battles, each success a temporary reprieve that had to be paid for with constant vigilance and recurring bloodshed. The psychological toll of this endless conflict was enormous, even for warriors who had been selected for their mental resilience and moral strength. The Abyss Watchers were forced to confront horrors that challenged their understanding of what reality could contain, to fight enemies that were often former friends or loved ones who had been transformed by dark influence, to make decisions that required them to sacrifice innocent lives for the greater good of preventing wider contamination. Over time, the Order developed rituals and practices designed to help its members cope with the spiritual burden of their calling. They created ceremonies that honored fallen comrades, while acknowledging that death in service to the cause was not merely acceptable, but necessary. They established meditation techniques that could help warriors maintain their sanity when confronted with manifestations of the abyss that seemed designed to drive observers to madness through their mere existence. Most importantly, they developed a philosophy that justified their existence and their actions through reference to cosmic principles that transcended individual desires or fears. The Abyss Watchers came to see themselves as instruments of divine will, warriors whose personal suffering was insignificant compared to the universal good they served by preventing the spread of darkness throughout the world. Yet, even as they fought their eternal war against the abyss, other forces were at work that would complicate their mission in ways they could not foresee. The Sable Church, a religious organization that had emerged from the scattered remnants of humanity who had not been fully contained by Gwyn's original curse, began to develop its own interpretation of what the relationship between light and dark should be. The Sable Church taught that the Age of Fire was not the natural or permanent state of existence, but merely one phase in an eternal cycle that would eventually give way to an Age of Dark. They argued that the suppression of humanity's true nature was not only unjust but ultimately unsustainable, that the attempts to maintain the flame through repeated sacrifice were doomed to failure and were causing more suffering than they prevented. The church's teachings attracted followers who had grown weary of the endless cycle of heroism and sacrifice that sustained the Age of Fire. People who wondered whether the world might be better served by accepting the natural transition to darkness, rather than fighting to preserve a system that seemed to demand ever greater prices for its continuation. They developed their own magical traditions and philosophical frameworks that embraced the dark soul as humanity's true inheritance rather than a curse to be suppressed. These dark sorcerers and philosophers posed a different kind of challenge to the established order than the chaotic corruption of the abyss. Where Manus and his followers represented darkness as pure destruction and transformation, the Sable Church offered darkness as an alternative form of order, a different way of organizing reality that might be more just and sustainable than the current system. The tension between these different interpretations of darkness created complications for the Abyss Watchers that their original training had not prepared them to handle. They had been created to fight the chaotic corruption of the Abyss, but they found themselves increasingly called upon to suppress the organized opposition of the Sable Church, a task that required them to act more like religious police than heroic warriors. This expansion of their role from protectors against chaos to enforcers of orthodoxy began to corrupt the very purpose for which the Order had been created. The Abyss Watchers found themselves fighting not just monsters and corrupted beings, but fellow humans who had committed no crime other than questioning the wisdom of the established order. The moral clarity that had once defined their mission became clouded by political considerations and religious disputes that had little to do with the cosmic struggle between light and dark. As the ages passed and the Order's mission became increasingly complex and morally ambiguous, internal divisions began to emerge among the Abyss Watchers themselves. Some remained true to the original purpose of fighting only the chaotic corruption of the Abyss, while others embraced their expanded role as guardians of orthodox thinking and suppressors of dangerous ideas. These divisions eventually led to conflicts within the Order that mirrored the larger struggles taking place throughout the realm. The tragic irony of the Abyss Watchers' fate was that their dedication to preventing the spread of darkness ultimately made them vulnerable to the very corruption they had sworn to fight. Their constant exposure to the influence of the Abyss, combined with the psychological stress of their impossible mission and the moral compromises required by their expanding role, gradually wore away at their resistance to dark influence. The process was slow and subtle, so gradual that individual members of the Order did not recognize what was happening to them until it was too late to reverse. The very qualities that had made them effective warriors against the Abyss, their willingness to sacrifice everything for their cause, their absolute dedication to their mission, their readiness to embrace any means necessary to achieve their ends, became the tools through which darkness infiltrated their ranks. When the corruption of the Abyss Watchers finally became apparent, it took the form not of obvious transformation into monsters, but of a more insidious change that turned their greatest strengths into their greatest weaknesses. They retained their skills and their dedication, but both became corrupted until they served the very forces they had been created to oppose. The Order that had been established to fight an eternal war against the Abyss became instead a symbol of how even the most noble purposes could be perverted by the endless conflict between light and dark. Their watchtowers became sources of the very corruption they had been built to contain, while their fortresses became strongholds from which dark influence could spread throughout the realm they had sworn to protect. Yet even in their corruption, the Abyss Watchers retained enough of their original nature to recognize what they had become. The knowledge of their fall from grace became its own form of torment, a constant reminder of how far they had strayed from the ideals that had once defined their existence. They became living monuments to the tragic impossibility of maintaining perfect vigilance against forces that were ultimately more patient and persistent than any mortal dedication could match. The legacy of the Abyss Watchers would echo through all the ages to come, serving as both inspiration and warning for future generations who would face their own struggles against the encroaching darkness. Their story demonstrated both the nobility of those who would sacrifice everything to protect others and the terrible cost of fighting enemies that could not be truly defeated, only temporarily contained. In the end, the Age of Dark that they had fought so hard to prevent would come not through the victory of obvious evil, but through the gradual erosion of the very institutions and ideals that had been created to preserve the light. The Abyss Watchers had succeeded in their immediate mission of containing Manus and his chaotic corruption, but their ultimate failure lay in their inability to address the fundamental contradictions that made the Age of Fire unsustainable in the long term. In the distant land of Drangleic, where the cycle of fire and dark had played out its eternal dance for countless ages, there arose a bearer of the curse, whose journey would reveal truths about the nature of existence that had been hidden even from the gods themselves. This was an age when the very concept of souls had begun to fade from the world, when the fundamental currency of consciousness and identity was growing scarce in ways that threatened the foundation of all reality. The kingdom of Drangleic stood as testament to how far civilization had progressed since the primitive days when gods and dragons had fought their first great war. Here were cities of stone and steel that rivaled even the golden halls of ancient Anor Londo, while the people who inhabited them had developed arts and sciences that pushed the boundaries of what mortal minds could achieve. Yet beneath this veneer of advancement and prosperity lay a corruption so fundamental that it threatened not merely the kingdom's prosperity, but the very possibility of conscious existence. King Vendrick, whose rule had brought Drangleic to its heights of glory and learning, was a monarch whose wisdom exceeded that of most who had worn crowns throughout the long history of the world. Unlike the gods who had preceded him, Vendrick understood that power without knowledge was meaningless, that authority without understanding was ultimately self-defeating. He had dedicated his reign not merely to governing his subjects, but to unraveling the deepest mysteries of existence itself. The king's studies had led him to discoveries that shook his faith in everything he had once believed about the nature of reality and the cosmic forces that governed it. Through scholarship and investigation that spanned decades, he had uncovered evidence that the cycle of fire and dark was not a natural phenomenon, but an artificial construct, a system imposed upon the world by beings whose motivations were far more complex and potentially sinister than anyone had previously suspected. Vendrick's research had revealed that the linking of the fire, that heroic sacrifice that was celebrated throughout the realm as the ultimate expression of noble duty, was in truth a form of cosmic manipulation designed to perpetuate a system that served interests beyond mortal comprehension. The heroes who gave their lives to kindle the flame were not saving the world, but feeding a mechanism that consumed consciousness itself, transforming the most fundamental aspect of existence into fuel for purposes that remained hidden from those who made the sacrifice. The implications of these discoveries were staggering in their scope and terrifying in their implications. If the cycle of fire and dark was indeed artificial, then everything that civilization had built upon its foundation was potentially false. Every assumption about the nature of good and evil potentially flawed. Every sacrifice made in service to the established order potentially meaningless or worse. Yet even as Vendrick grappled with these cosmic revelations, his kingdom faced a more immediate crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had built before he could act upon his newfound knowledge. The souls that served as the basic medium of consciousness and identity were disappearing from the world at an accelerating rate, vanishing in ways that suggested not natural dissipation, but active consumption by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of existence. This fading of souls manifested itself in countless ways throughout Drangleic, each more disturbing than the last. People began to lose their memories and their sense of individual identity, becoming hollow shells that retained their physical forms but lacked the essential spark that made them truly alive. The magic that had once flowed freely throughout the kingdom began to fail as the souls that powered it grew scarce and weak. Even the basic processes of life and death became unreliable, as the cosmic mechanisms that governed them found themselves starved of the spiritual fuel they required to function properly. The bearer of the curse who emerged during this time of crisis was marked by afflictions that reflected the fundamental breakdown of the systems that had once maintained order and meaning in the world. Unlike the heroes of earlier ages who had been chosen by destiny or divine intervention to fulfill great purposes, the bearer carried within themselves the symptoms of a reality that was coming apart at its most basic level. The curse that marked this chosen one was not merely the familiar dark sign that had plagued humanity since Gwyn's original manipulation of their nature, but something deeper and more comprehensive that reflected the systemic failure of the cosmic order itself. This was a curse that caused not just death and resurrection, but a gradual erosion of everything that made existence meaningful. A slow dissolution of consciousness that mirrored what was happening to the world as a whole. Yet, it was precisely this curse that made the bearer uniquely qualified to understand and potentially resolve the crisis that threatened all existence. Where others saw only symptoms of decline and decay, the bearer could perceive the underlying patterns that connected individual suffering to cosmic dysfunction. Their own gradual loss of identity and memory served as a microcosm of what was happening to reality itself, making them perhaps the only being capable of grasping the full scope of what needed to be addressed. The bearer's journey through Drangleic became a pilgrimage through the accumulated failures and contradictions of ages of misguided attempts to impose order upon forces that were fundamentally beyond control. In the ruins of great cities and the depths of forgotten dungeons, they encountered evidence of civilizations that had risen and fallen in pursuit of solutions to problems they did not fully understand, leaving behind only monuments to their noble failures and tragic misconceptions. Each area that the bearer explored told its own story of how the fundamental breakdown of the soul-based economy of existence had affected different aspects of society and culture. In some places, the scarcity of souls had led to wars of unprecedented savagery, as different factions fought over the dwindling reserves of spiritual essence that remained. In others, the gradual loss of consciousness had transformed once vibrant communities into collections of hollow automatons who went through the motions of life without any real understanding of what they were doing or why. The most disturbing discoveries came in the deepest places, where the bearer found evidence of experiments and rituals that had been conducted by those who, like King Vendrick, had perceived the true nature of the crisis, but had attempted to address it through methods that only made the situation worse. These scholars and sorcerers had tried to create artificial souls, to establish new cycles of spiritual renewal, to find ways of sustaining consciousness without depending on the failing systems that had once seemed eternal and unchangeable. All of these attempts had failed, often catastrophically, leaving behind corrupted landscapes and transformed beings that served as warnings about the dangers of trying to manipulate forces beyond mortal comprehension. Yet their failures were not merely cautionary tales, but valuable sources of information about the nature of the problems that needed to be solved and the limitations that constrained any possible solutions. As the bearer progressed deeper into the mysteries surrounding the fading of souls, They began to encounter figures who possessed knowledge that had been hidden from the world for reasons that became increasingly apparent as the full scope of the crisis revealed itself. Chief among these was Aldir, King Vendrick's brother, whose own research into the nature of existence had led him down paths that had transformed him into something that was no longer entirely human, yet retained the capacity for wisdom and understanding. Aldir had sacrificed his physical form in pursuit of knowledge that could not be gained through conventional means, becoming a being of pure consciousness that could perceive realities normally hidden from embodied minds. His transformation had been both voluntary and necessary. A recognition that understanding the true nature of the cosmic crisis required abandoning the limitations that constrained normal perception and thought. Through conversations with this transformed scholar, the bearer began to understand that the fading of souls was not a natural phenomenon or an accidental consequence of magical experimentation, but the inevitable result of a system that had been designed to be unsustainable from the beginning. The cycle of fire and dark, the linking ritual, the entire structure of divine authority and cosmic order had been created by beings who understood that it would eventually consume itself, yet had implemented it anyway for reasons that remained obscure. Aldir's research had revealed that the original architects of the Age of Fire had been aware that their system would require ever-increasing amounts of spiritual fuel to maintain itself, that each linking of the flame would demand greater sacrifices and produce diminishing returns, that eventually the entire mechanism would collapse under the weight of its own impossible requirements. Yet they had proceeded with their plan anyway, suggesting motivations that went beyond simple ignorance or miscalculation. The scholar of the first sin, as Aldir came to be known, had developed theories about what these motivations might have been, hypotheses that painted the gods and their followers not as benevolent protectors of civilization, but as participants in a cosmic experiment whose true purpose remained hidden from those who suffered its consequences. According to his understanding, the entire history of civilization since the defeat of the dragons had been shaped by forces that viewed conscious beings not as ends in themselves, but as means to purposes that transcended individual welfare or happiness. This perspective transformed everything about how the bearer understood their own quest and the choices they faced. If the cycle of fire and dark was indeed an artificial system designed to serve hidden purposes, then the traditional heroic response of sacrificing oneself to maintain it was not noble service but complicity, in a form of cosmic exploitation that condemned countless future beings to suffering and eventual annihilation. Yet the alternative to maintaining the failing system was not simply to allow it to collapse, but to find some way of creating new structures that could sustain consciousness and meaning without depending on the mechanisms that were proving themselves unsustainable. This required not just courage and determination, but wisdom that could encompass the full complexity of the cosmic forces that needed to be addressed. The bearer's exploration of Drangleic eventually led them to encounters with the remnants of other civilizations that had faced similar crises, including the giants whose invasion of the kingdom had been motivated not by conquest or malice, but by desperate attempts to escape the collapse of their own systems of spiritual sustainability. These conflicts revealed that the crisis affecting Drangleic was not unique, but part of a larger pattern of breakdown that was affecting multiple realms and dimensions of existence. The war between Drangleic and the giants had been fought over misunderstandings that reflected the fundamental inadequacy of the conceptual frameworks that both sides used to interpret their experiences. The giants had sought to preserve their own spiritual integrity by claiming resources they needed for survival, while the humans had defended what they perceived as unprovoked aggression, without understanding the cosmic forces that drove their enemies to desperate actions. King Vendrick's response to these revelations had been to withdraw from active governance and pursue research that might lead to solutions beyond the conventional options of linking or allowing the fire to fade. His studies had led him to construct what would become known as the Throne of Want, a device designed to concentrate and focus the remaining spiritual forces in ways that might allow conscious beings to transcend the limitations of the failing cosmic system. Yet even Vendrick's wisdom had proven insufficient to complete this great work. The king had realized that the knowledge necessary to operate such a device safely required understanding that no single consciousness could contain, wisdom that could only emerge from the combination of multiple perspectives and forms of awareness working in harmony toward common goals. The bearer of the curse found themselves at the center of this cosmic puzzle, carrying within their cursed form the potential to serve as a bridge between different levels of reality and different forms of consciousness. Their gradual loss of individual identity, rather than being simply a tragic consequence of their curse, represented a necessary preparation for the kind of expanded awareness that would be required to address the fundamental problems affecting all existence. The choice that ultimately confronted the bearer was not the simple binary decision between linking the fire or allowing it to fade that had defined the heroic quests of earlier ages, but a more complex set of options that reflected the deeper understanding of cosmic forces that their journey had provided. They could indeed choose to link the fire and extend the current system for another age, knowing full well that this would only postpone the ultimate crisis while making it more severe when it finally arrived. Alternatively, they could choose to allow the fire to fade and usher in an age of dark, understanding that this transition would bring its own forms of suffering and uncertainty, but might also create opportunities for new forms of consciousness and meaning to emerge from the collapse of the old order. But the most significant option available to them was to claim the Throne of Want and attempt to transcend the entire cycle of fire and dark, to become a being capable of establishing new cosmic principles that could sustain consciousness without depending on the mechanisms that had proven themselves unsustainable. This path offered the greatest potential for genuine resolution of the cosmic crisis, but also carried the greatest risks, since failure could result not just in personal annihilation, but in the destruction of the very possibility of conscious existence. The bearer's ultimate choice would depend not just on their personal courage or wisdom, but on their understanding of what consciousness itself meant, and whether it was worth the risks and sacrifices required to preserve it in new forms. They had learned through their journey that the easy answers of earlier ages were no longer adequate, that the challenges facing existence itself required responses that went beyond conventional heroism or traditional virtue. In the end, the bearer of the curse stood at the threshold of transformation that could remake the very nature of reality, carrying within themselves both the accumulated wisdom of all who had struggled with these questions before them, and the terrible responsibility of making choices whose consequences would echo through all future ages. The cycle might continue, or it might end, or it might be transformed into something entirely new, depending on decisions that no amount of preparation could make simple or certain. The fading of souls had revealed the ultimate fragility of all the systems that conscious beings had created to give meaning and structure to their existence. Yet, it had also demonstrated the remarkable persistence of consciousness itself, its capacity to adapt and evolve, even under conditions that seemed to make its continuation impossible. Whether this persistence would prove sufficient to carry existence through the transition to whatever came next remained the greatest question of all, one whose answer lay beyond the horizon of even the most far-seeing wisdom. In the final age of fire, when the very concept of heroism had been worn thin by countless cycles of sacrifice and renewal, there arose from the ashes of forgotten funeral pyres an ashen one whose awakening marked the beginning of the end for all the ancient certainties that had governed existence since the first flames were kindled in the primordial darkness. This was not merely another chosen undead called to link the fire in service to a cosmic order that had long since revealed its fundamental contradictions, but something altogether more significant and terrible, a being whose very existence represented the failure of the system that had sustained the Age of Fire for countless millennia. The world into which the Ashen One awakened was one that bore only passing resemblance to the golden realm that Gwyn had once ruled from his throne of crystal and light. The great kingdoms that had risen and fallen in service to the flame's continuation had left behind not monuments to their glory, but evidence of their inadequacy, ruins that spoke not of noble sacrifice, but of the futility of trying to preserve through repetition what had been doomed from its inception to eventual collapse. Lothric, the kingdom that had been built upon the accumulated knowledge of all previous attempts to maintain the cosmic order, stood as perhaps the most magnificent and simultaneously most tragic of all the civilizations that had attempted to solve the fundamental problems inherent in the Age of Fire. Its spires reached toward heaven with architectural ambition that dwarfed even the greatest works of ancient Anor Londo, while its libraries contained wisdom that had been gathered from the ruins of every kingdom that had fallen in service to the flame's perpetuation. Yet beneath this veneer of accumulated learning and refined culture lay a rot that had been growing for ages beyond counting, a spiritual decay that reflected the exhaustion of the very principles upon which the kingdom had been founded. The scholars and priests who maintained Lothric's institutions of learning and worship went through the motions of their ancient duties with the mechanical precision of beings who had forgotten why their work had ever seemed important, while the nobility who governed the realm made decisions based on traditions whose original purposes had been lost to the passage of time. At the heart of this magnificent decay sat Prince Lothric, the one who had been chosen and groomed from birth to serve as the next sacrifice to the first flame, the heir to centuries of accumulated wisdom about the nature of the cosmos and the requirements for maintaining its stability. Yet, Lothric represented something unprecedented in the long history of heroic sacrifice, a potential Lord of Cinder who had come to understand the true nature of what was being asked of him and had made the conscious decision to refuse. The prince's rejection of his destined role was not born from cowardice or selfishness, but from a profound understanding of what the linking ritual actually accomplished and what it failed to address. Through study and contemplation that had consumed his entire life, Lothric had grasped truths that had been hidden from all previous generations of heroes. Recognizing that the cycle of sacrifice and renewal was not preserving civilization but slowly consuming it from within, Lothric had seen through the elaborate mythologies and noble justifications that surrounded the linking ritual to perceive its fundamental nature as a form of cosmic vampirism, a process that sustained the appearance of order and meaning by draining the very essence from those who possessed the greatest capacity for consciousness and transformation. Each hero who had given their life to kindle the flame had not saved the world but had fed a mechanism that grew more demanding and less sustainable with each iteration. The prince's refusal to fulfill his role as the designated sacrifice created a crisis that went far beyond the immediate practical problem of finding an alternative source of fuel for the dying flame. His rejection called into question the entire philosophical and theological framework that had justified the system of heroic sacrifice, challenging assumptions that had been accepted without question for so long that they had come to seem like natural laws rather than artificial constructs. This crisis of legitimacy manifested itself throughout Lothric and beyond, in ways that revealed how thoroughly the kingdom's entire social and cultural structure depended on maintaining the fiction that the linking ritual was both necessary and noble, without the assurance that their sacrifices served a greater purpose. The institutions that had sustained civilization for countless ages began to lose their coherence and their capacity to inspire the devotion necessary for their continuation. The failure of the linking ritual had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of Lothric, creating disturbances in the fabric of reality itself that manifested as the convergence of lands and times that had previously been separate and distinct. This was not merely a magical phenomenon, but a sign that the cosmic order that had maintained the boundaries between different realms and different ages was beginning to break down under the strain of its own accumulated contradictions. The converging lands brought together in one place representatives of every age and every attempt to address the fundamental problems that the Age of Fire had never successfully resolved. Ancient kingdoms rose from the earth to stand beside more recent civilizations, while heroes and villains from different eras found themselves sharing the same battlefields and facing the same impossible choices that had defined their original conflicts. This convergence created opportunities for understanding and resolution that had never existed before, as beings who had been separated by vast gulfs of time and space were brought together to share their accumulated wisdom and confront their common challenges. Yet it also intensified the conflicts and contradictions that had driven the cycle of rise and decline, creating a situation where all the unresolved tensions of countless ages were concentrated into a single moment of unprecedented crisis and possibility. The Ashen One who emerged into this transformed world carried within themselves the accumulated failure of every previous attempt to resolve the cosmic crisis through heroic action. Unlike the chosen undead of earlier ages, who had been marked by hope and the possibility of genuine achievement, the Ashen One bore the stigma of having already failed in their attempt to link the fire, of having proven inadequate to the task that was supposed to represent the highest expression of noble service. This failure, rather than disqualifying them from significance, actually made them uniquely suited to understand and address the true nature of the problems facing existence itself. Where previous heroes had approached their quests with confidence in the righteousness of their cause and the adequacy of traditional solutions, the Ashen One possessed the bitter wisdom that comes from having discovered through direct experience that the conventional approaches were insufficient. The journey through the converged lands became a pilgrimage through the accumulated failures and partial successes of every civilization that had attempted to build something lasting in the face of forces that seemed determined to reduce all achievements to ash and memory. Each area that the Ashen One explored contained lessons about different approaches to the fundamental questions of existence, different strategies for dealing with the tension between order and chaos, different attempts to find meaning in the face of apparent meaninglessness. In the undead settlement, they encountered the remnants of communities that had tried to maintain human dignity and cooperation, even under conditions that seemed designed to make such virtues impossible. These settlements represented the attempt to preserve civilization at its most basic level, to maintain the simple human connections that made existence bearable, even when larger purposes and grand narratives had proven themselves inadequate. The Cathedral of the Deep revealed the corruption that could overtake even the most sacred institutions when they became disconnected from the genuine spiritual needs they were originally meant to serve. Here was a monument to how religious faith could become twisted into something that served the interests of cosmic parasites rather than the welfare of the faithful, demonstrating the need for constant vigilance against the perversion of noble purposes. Farron Keep and the Crucifixion Woods showed what happened when the attempt to preserve ancient traditions became more important than understanding why those traditions had been valuable in the first place. The Abyss Watchers, who had once been heroes of light, had become trapped in an eternal cycle of conflict that served no purpose beyond its own perpetuation, fighting a war that had long since lost any connection to the goals it was supposed to achieve. Each encounter and each revelation added to the Ashen One's understanding of what would be required to break free from the cycles of repetition and failure that had characterized every previous attempt to address the cosmic crisis. The traditional solution of linking the fire had been tried countless times and had never achieved more than temporary postponement of the underlying problems, while allowing the fire to fade had its own forms of tragedy and loss that made it equally unsatisfactory as a final answer. The convergence of lands had brought together not only different places but different possibilities, creating a unique moment when alternative approaches that had never been available before might finally be attempted. The painted world that the Ashen One discovered in their travels represented one such alternative, a realm that existed outside the cycle of fire and dark and offered the possibility of creating something genuinely new, rather than simply perpetuating variations on ancient themes. The young painter who lived within that world possessed the ability to create new realities through art and imagination, to bring into existence forms of consciousness and meaning that did not depend on the mechanisms that had sustained the Age of Fire, but had proven themselves ultimately self-defeating. Her work represented the possibility of transcending the entire framework within which the cosmic crisis had developed, offering the hope of solutions that went beyond the limited options that had defined all previous attempts at resolution. Yet even this hopeful possibility came with its own requirements and challenges. The creation of a new world through artistic vision required not just inspiration and talent, but the accumulated essence of everything that had been valuable in the old world, including the sacrifices and failures that had revealed the inadequacy of previous approaches. The dark soul of man, that fragment of primordial consciousness that had been suppressed and manipulated throughout the Age of Fire, would need to serve as the foundational element for whatever came next. The Ashen One's ultimate confrontation was not with a single enemy or a particular manifestation of evil, but with the accumulated weight of every decision and every sacrifice that had shaped the history of consciousness since the first flame was kindled. In the kiln of the first flame, they faced the soul of Cinder, a being that embodied every hero who had ever linked the fire, every champion who had given their life to preserve a system that had never been sustainable. This final opponent was not motivated by malice or ambition, but by a kind of institutional momentum that had become divorced from any genuine purpose or understanding. The soul of Cinder fought with all the skill and determination of every hero who had ever served the cause of light, yet its battle was ultimately meaningless, because it served a system that had long since revealed its fundamental inadequacy. The victory over this accumulated embodiment of heroic tradition was not a triumph in the conventional sense, but rather a recognition that the entire framework within which such battles had meaning was coming to an end. The Age of Fire could continue through another linking, but only by perpetuating the same cycles of sacrifice and failure that had characterized all previous iterations. Alternatively, it could be allowed to end, ushering in transformations whose nature and consequences could not be predicted or controlled. The choices available to the Ashen One at the end of their journey reflected the full complexity of the situation that had been developing throughout the entire history of the Age of Fire. They could link the fire themselves, becoming another sacrifice to a system whose failures they understood better than anyone who had made that choice before them. They could allow the fire to fade and usher in an age of dark whose nature would be shaped by forces that had been suppressed for so long that their true character remained mysterious. Most significantly, they could choose to serve the painter's vision and help create a world that existed outside the cycle of fire and dark entirely, a realm where consciousness could develop according to principles that had never been tested before because they had never been possible within the constraints of the existing cosmic order. This choice offered the greatest potential for genuine transformation, but also carried the greatest risks, since success would require abandoning all the familiar landmarks that had guided previous generations of heroes and explorers. The Ashen One's decision would not only determine their own fate, but would establish the conditions under which all future consciousness would have to develop. Unlike previous heroes whose choices had affected only their own age and the immediate succession of events, the Ashen One stood at a genuine crossroads where the fundamental nature of existence itself could be altered in ways that would echo through eternity. The moment of choice arrived without fanfare or cosmic drama, in the quiet aftermath of battles whose significance had been determined not by their outcome but by the understanding they had made possible. The Ashen One stood in the fading light of the first flame, carrying within themselves the accumulated wisdom and the accumulated failures of every age that had contributed to this final moment of transformation. Whatever choice they made would mark the end of the Age of Fire as it had been understood since the first kindling in the primordial darkness, and the beginning of something that had never existed before in any form. The dance of fire and dark that had defined existence for so long was finally approaching its conclusion, though what would emerge from that ending remained hidden in the darkness that waits beyond the edge of every flame's light. The cycle that had seemed eternal was revealing itself to be merely one movement in a larger symphony of consciousness that encompassed transformations too vast for any single mind to grasp. The Ashen One had become the final note in that movement, the transition point between what had been and what was yet to come, carrying within themselves both the conclusion of ancient stories and the beginning of narratives that had never been told before. And so we reach the end of our journey through fire and dark, having witnessed the rise and fall of ages, the choices of gods and mortals, and the eternal cycle that binds all things in patterns too vast for any single consciousness to fully comprehend. In these tales of light and shadow, we find not simple answers to the questions that have plagued thinking beings since awareness first stirred in the primordial darkness, but something far more valuable and enduring. The recognition that existence itself is a dance between forces that can never be finally reconciled, only eternally balanced. The story we have shared tonight is one that speaks to truths deeper than the specific details of kingdoms risen and fallen, deeper than the particular struggles of heroes and villains whose names echo through the halls of legend. It is a meditation on the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, on what it means to choose and to sacrifice, to hope and to despair, to create meaning in the face of forces that seem indifferent to all our deepest yearnings and most cherished beliefs. Throughout all the ages we have explored together, from the grey stillness of the ancient dragons to the convergent chaos of the final flame, one truth has remained constant. That consciousness, once awakened, possesses a persistence and creativity that no amount of cosmic indifference can entirely extinguish. Even when the very foundations of reality have cracked and crumbled, even when the cycles that once seemed eternal have revealed themselves to be temporary constructs, the spark of awareness that makes choice possible has continued to burn in forms both familiar and unimaginable. We have seen how the gods, in their attempt to create perfect order, generated the very chaos they sought to prevent. We have witnessed how heroes, in their dedication to noble causes, sometimes perpetuated the very evils they fought to overcome. We have observed how the attempt to preserve what is good and valuable can become a force for stagnation and decay when it loses sight of the growth and change that give life its meaning. Yet we have also seen something else, something that shines through even the darkest moments of our tale. The indomitable capacity of conscious beings to recognize their mistakes and seek better paths, to learn from failure and transform suffering into wisdom, to find hope and beauty, even in circumstances that seem designed to crush both. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of all. The understanding that redemption is always possible for those who possess the courage to acknowledge their errors and the determination to choose differently. The fire may fade and darkness may come, but always there will be those who choose to kindle new flames or embrace the coming dark with wisdom rather than fear. The cycles may continue in forms we recognize, or they may be transformed into patterns so new and strange that they challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of existence itself. But whatever comes, consciousness will endure, will adapt, will find ways to create meaning and beauty and connection, even under conditions that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. As you drift towards sleep, remember that even in the darkest night, embers remain, waiting for the breath that will make them blaze again. Remember that every ending contains within itself the seeds of new beginnings, every conclusion the potential for fresh starts. Remember that the choices we make, however small they might seem in the face of cosmic forces beyond our understanding, ripple outward in ways that shape the future, in directions we can barely imagine. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will, in the endless dance between fire and dark that defines all existence. But it continues not as mere repetition, but as variation on eternal themes, each iteration bringing new possibilities, new forms of consciousness, new ways of understanding what it means to be aware in a universe that is far stranger and more wonderful than any single mind can grasp. Sleep now in the knowledge that you are part of this great story, that your own choices and dreams and struggles contribute to the ongoing creation of meaning in a cosmos that depends on conscious beings to recognize its beauty and confront its challenges. Rest in the understanding that no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always comes in forms both expected and surprising, bringing with it opportunities for growth and transformation that make all the struggles worthwhile. The dance goes on, and we are all part of its eternal rhythm, spinning between light and shadow, hope and despair, creation and destruction, in patterns that connect us to everything that has ever been and everything that ever will be. Dream well, and when you wake, remember that you carry within yourself both the flame that lights the darkness and the darkness that gives the flame its meaning, and that both are necessary for the continuation of the dance that is existence itself.